So welcome everybody to the MIDAS webinar, the first of our 2023 spring season. Just to introduce myself, I'm Harry Hockheiser, a director of the MIDAS Coordination Center, and it's my pleasure to sort of be the host here and to welcome all of you into our talk today. I want to introduce our speaker is Pedro Nascimento de Lima. Excuse me, I hope I got that right. Pedro is an associate engineer at the RAND Corporation. And if I read his CV correctly, Pedro is a pretty newly minted PhD from the RAND Graduate School. And so I want to offer my congratulations to him for passing through that milestone. Pedro's work looks at simulation modeling, high performance computing, and decision under deep uncertainty methods to inform health policy decisions. And I think we can all appreciate that if there's anything that we deal with a lot in infectious disease models, it's uncertainty. So I think I'm interested in hearing what Pedro has to say on the topic. And so Pedro, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harry. Thanks everyone for joining. So I'll start my slides. Yeah, so hopefully now you can see the title slide. And if not, someone please.
It looks great. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So this talk is titled Deep Uncertainty 101 for Infectious Disease Modelers. What it is, why you should care, and what we can do about it. And I'm very excited to present to this group. MIDAS has been a great network, great community for me to work with and engage. So I'm very excited to give this talk. So I have a 7-part agenda. I'll start with a motivation for this talk. Then I'll talk about what is deep uncertainty, where this theme came from, what we can do to address deep uncertainty, how one of the methods that were created to address deep uncertainty works. And I'll give you a very short example, which I actually already presented to this community. But most importantly, going forward, what we are doing to address deep uncertainty in this field and health policy in general, and what you can do to engage with these concepts. And I hope you find this fun and interesting. So where I'm coming from, I think it's nice to say. So I have a kind of odd background in this community, as many of you maybe have as well. I'm originally from Brazil. I taught simulation modeling on other disciplines in an industry engineering department. And then used robust decision making on my master's dissertation. And that got me interested in doing a PhD in policy analysis at RAND Graduate School, where I did a dissertation on robust decision-making to inform health policy with applications to COVID-19 and cancer screening. And right after that, I continue at RAND. I'm now an associate engineer, and I work at this intersection of modeling, computing, and policy analysis. And I should also say I'm very interested in that because I'm also a member of the leadership team of the Society for Decision-Making Under Deep Uncertainty. You can find more about my work at this link. So my goals for you in this talk, at the end of this talk, you should be familiar with the deep uncertainty concept and a few principles underlying decision-making under deep uncertainty methods. You should have a high-level understanding of one of such methods, how one of such methods work, namely robust decision-making, learn how to engage with these ideas going forward, and hopefully have some fun along the way. And at the end, you see a little bit of a slide about that. But going forward, you should know that this talk is based on a set of papers. And this particular paper, chapter 2 in my dissertation, talks about COVID-19 and deep uncertainty. So there's a lot that I'm drawing from there, and also from prior applications and papers that we wrote. So you should be able to find more information there. Okay, so starting with motivation, why deep uncertainty is relevant and why I think it's relevant to you, to this community. So I think we can all agree that pandemic response involves tough decisions. It's really hard to make those decisions. And so many countries, jurisdictions, we introduce public health and social measures, including social distancing, mask wearing, business closures, and so on and so forth. And making those decisions is quite challenging because it involves complex, uncertain, and urgent decisions. And there are multiple layers of decision-making, which make this really complicated, but also really interesting to work in. Now, decision makers, they do have options to control pandemics. So there are many things we can do, but we don't really have reliable predictions of their long-term effects. So I think we can all agree that predicting the long term of a pandemic is quite challenging. Some would say probably impossible. So our models are really not accurate after a few weeks in terms of prediction validity, and uncertainty precludes long-term foresight here. But we can do things to control pandemics. So how do we handle this? How do we inform the decisions? So this situation challenges what we call predict and act decision-making approaches, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. For example, we still don't know the full costs or benefits of lockdowns. We may never know. And we don't have a consensus about how to weigh them, these full costs and benefits. Models are really useful to pandemic response, but it's important to know how to use them appropriately, rather than ask modelers to pretend to do what can be done. And that kind of quote comes from this paper from Banks that talks about exploratory modeling. More on that later. Okay, so in that dissertation paper, I talked about 3 roles for models in informing public health and social measures to respond to pandemics. And causal inference is really the main framework. It's the thing that everyone in health policy learns, and is kind of the main frame to think about treatment effects. So the focus for causal inference, or this mode of using models, is really to focus on estimating effects of policies or treatments. And ideally, we would want causal estimates for every intervention we can think of, right? So if we can have all these causal estimates, then it would be great. We would be able to make decisions a lot better. But we don't have these estimates. And by the time we have them, it's often too late, because we have to make decisions in timely decisions. So we can also draw from forecasting, right? We can also use models in this forecasting mode, where we are looking at future and trying to predict the short-term trajectory of the pandemic and several outcomes, aggregate outcomes. And it's great to use these forecasts to raise awareness of an impending disaster, right? You do want these forecasts, because otherwise people, they don't know what's coming. But forecasts alone, they don't make value judgments, and they don't tell us what to do. And forecasting beyond 4 weeks has proven really hard. So, okay, we don't have forecasts over the full time horizon of our decisions. What do we use models for? So there is a third mode or role for modelings, which is under this concept of decision analysis, where you're looking at different options over potentially different futures and trying to make good decisions. And we try to do that in a way that acknowledges uncertainty and acknowledges the values of people that are involved in that decision, right? Trying to find good decisions for a population. And so this talk is really about work that is done under that decision analysis mode. You can also talk about scenarios, which are interesting. Sometimes you can think about scenarios in terms of forecasting. They are kind of conditional forecasts. We make a set of assumptions that deviate from status quo and have kind of a conditional forecast. But you can also think about them in the decision analysis mode as well. So this talk is about decision and making decisions under uncertainty. So these decisions and public health social measures, they are difficult, I would argue, and we would argue, because they are deeply uncertain decisions. So deciding when to introduce and remove these policies, like lockdowns, like very salient policies, is difficult because we may not agree on the appropriate ways to characterize all the relevant interactions between the pandemic, the economy, and welfare in general, right? How people live their lives. Even if we did, we may also not agree or find credible ways to judge likelihood and effects of consequential future events, like the emergence and characteristics of a new variant strain, for example. So even if you had a perfect model that perfectly represents the past and today, you may not be able to agree on what's coming next. And even if you did, okay, we have a perfect model that predicts future variants. Let's say we finally got to that point and we actually trust those models. we may never reach a consensus on how to balance competing goals, like health, welfare, freedom, some will say it as well. So these situations, they really match the description of making decisions in a pandemic. And they are actually the three characteristics that define a deeply uncertain problem. And that definition, it predates the pandemic. So I think these concepts might be useful because they kind of match the problem we're facing or we faced. Under those conditions, traditional decision analysis is difficult to use, but the solution is not to discredit models. So there are traditional decision analytic approaches you can use, and they're very using treatment cost effectiveness, for example. So that traditional framework, it might be difficult to apply under these conditions if you don't know how to characterize these three things very well. All the uncertainties probabilistically, if you don't know how to value policy relevant outcomes, like how to balance health, economic, and all outcomes that people care about, or how to model parts of the systems that are relevant to the decision. So if you don't know how to do these things very well, it can be very hard to do that kind of decision analysis. It can be particularly difficult for COVID-19 or pandemic response. And as a challenge, I would ask anyone to show me one kind of good cost effectiveness analysis of public health and social measure policies that includes all relevant costs and benefits, and that adheres to the best practices in cost effectiveness guidelines applied to pharmaceutical interventions. And I don't say that to say that there's not enough good work being done. I'm just saying that's probably impossible because we don't agree on all these things. So what do? The solution, we say, it's not to discredit models. It's not to abandon modeling and say, oh, we can model this, we can predict, so we do whatever we want, but to use them in a way that not require unattainable assumptions. So that's kind of the spirit of the deep uncertainty methods and the field. So what is deep uncertainty anyways? So now that I hopefully motivated this talk and I explained why we think this is in principle relevant to the field, now let's just talk about deep uncertainty as it was originally proposed. So a brief history here. So RAND researchers and models in general, they always are tasked to provide objective policy analysis in deeply uncertain problems. This work often involves modeling future events. So examples include nuclear strategy, combat strategy like military strategy, climate change, water resources management, coastal resilience. All these fields, these policy fields, they require using a model and making some assumptions, inferences about the future and telling people what to do. And across all of these fields, I see modelers often being accused of certain things like producing black boxes that should not be trusted, or not including details that seem pertinent, or making assumptions that in the future prove wrong, accounting for what can be modeled and ignoring what can't be modeled, and fundamentally not being able to predict the future. So often these criticisms, they often actually come from people who are not doing a lot of modeling as well. But to a certain extent, they make sense. But we think there is a better way to think about modeling under these conditions of deep uncertainty. So in the literature, in the deep uncertainty literature, these criticisms, we say they are grounded in predict then act decision frameworks. So usually, and in most fields of science, we kind of use a predict and act framework. We start with describing what the future conditions will be. That often comes in the form of a model with a joint probability distribution, describing uncertainty relevant to that model. And we can obtain that from Bayesian inference and so on and so forth, or other methods. But at the end of the day, we have a model with some probabilistic information about uncertainty. Then we use that to determine what is the best decision, right? So usually that means optimizing an utility function and finding the maximum expected utility decision. And then at the end, we may do a sensitivity analysis and ask how sensitive is the decision to future conditions. So this is what the literature calls predict and act framework. The problem with trying to use this kind of way to think about decisions is that under conditions of deep uncertainty, this process can be a little bit counterproductive because there's lack of predictability, which is fundamental lack of predictability of the system we are looking at. Predictions are not accurate sometimes over the relevant time horizon, which is what we have with forecasting of infectious diseases as well. Sometimes we have lack of agreement over the appropriate goals to judge policies, stakeholders with wildly different preferences, people that are really pushing trade-offs in the decision problem, lack of trust on experts, disagreement of model structures, and so on and so on. And when you have that, trying to use this approach can be very difficult. So the good news is that people in other fields, they went over this problem again and again and again over several years and decades. And there is kind of a consensus in some fields that you can't just try to predict better to get out of this problem. Instead, some people have proposed agree on decisions processes, and they argue or we claim that they can be more helpful when the future is not predictable. So the way they work is that they start with a proposed strategy. So start with a plan, start with what you want to do and a decision framing. Use models to stress test that strategy or initial set of strategies. And by stress test, we mean simulating a set of strategies over a wide range of features and finding out how robust those strategies are. And then use that information to identify new, revised strategies that are more robust. So that process is trying to focus on the quality of the decisions and trying to agree on decisions, even when we cannot agree on the assumptions and all the uncertainty that's going into this process. So the way these processes work, ideally, is that we want to work with a group of people. So this first step usually involves stakeholders, people who are involved in the decision and will make the decision eventually. Then modelers use models to stress strategies. And then with decision makers, we identify new and revised strategies and kind of do this process iteratively. So this is what exists. And I just would like to say that some of these ideas can be traced back to the 1950s, starting with Herman Kahn and his thought about military planning in an uncertain world. He also did a lot of work in actually coining the term scenarios back in the 60s, thinking about nuclear strategy. And then later, there was a lot of work on this method called assumption-based planning, and it was about using information about a problem to figure out what are the assumptions that need to hold for a plan to work. And then with the advancement of models, we started doing that with modeling. So Banks in 1993 wrote this paper about exploratory modeling for policy analysis, where he discusses the use of models for exploration rather than only prediction. And then more recently, Rob Lampert and others at RAND proposed the robust decision-making method, which I'll talk about. And then a group of people, not only at RAND, but in other places, have created these set of methods collectively called decision-making under deep uncertainty methods. And there are many fields that are kind of involved in this. Largely, this is kind of the physical sciences, people talking about climate change and so on. So these methods exist elsewhere, and the question is, can we use them to inform pandemic policy response and problems involving infectious disease models? So to summarize, what is deep uncertainty? So this concept was formalized to represent conditions in which analysts or stakeholders, they do not know or cannot agree on the appropriate models to describe interactions among the system's variables, probability distributions to represent uncertainty, and value, and how to value the desirability of alternative outcomes. And I would argue we have all the above in infectious disease modeling, especially during a pandemic. So under those conditions, the literature says it's very hard to use predict and act approaches because they may result in gridlock or overconfidence in predictions. So what can we do to address deep uncertainty, specifically in this field? So before I go any further, I just want to say and assure you that I 100% acknowledge all the work you have done. Okay, so this field, infectious disease modeling field, has done a lot of work to advance decision support during the pandemic and before. So in this field, it's really interesting because we have multi-paradigm model development. We have people who do ODEs, network-based ABMs of people travel, and all sorts of models that can be used to answer different questions. That's great. Not every field has that. So you should be very happy that you have all these kinds of models that can be used. There's also some work in trying to enhance representation of behavior and economic vectors in models, which is great, because these are very important aspects of the problem we're looking at. There's also a lot of work on comparative collaborative modeling, the forecasting hub, the scenarios hub. All these, they really help address dependency of predictions on models. So that's great. That's a huge step forward. And also there has been a lot of work developing simulation-based inference methods, without which would be really hard to characterize any uncertainty, even about the past. So here I'm talking about POMP, I'm talking about like ABC, all the methods that we use to calibrate, to inform our models. So what I'm presenting here is not really something to replace any of the above. It really is something that can be used to build on these work. Okay, now going forward, there's this set of methods. They are collectively called decision-making under deep uncertainty. And they really seek to inform good decisions, even when we cannot have good predictions. So they include robust decision-making, dynamic adaptive planning, and others. There's a book about them. This is an open source book, by the way. And there is a society of scientists that organize meetings where we discuss how to advance decisions under those conditions. You can actually become a member at deepuncertainty.org. So these methods, they are different, but they share a common set of principles. And you will find more discussion about those principles in that dissertation chapter that I talked about. So usually they begin with problem framing, not modeling. So they start thinking about how to bound the problem, what are the uncertainties, what are the outcomes we need to consider, how to tie them together with a model, and what are the outcomes that we need to consider. So then we use models to stress test strategies, not as crystal balls, not as prediction objects. And the idea here is really to deliver a robustness assessment of a set of strategies under a wide set of conditions. Then we want to seek robust strategies that work no matter what the future holds. That's the idea we are seeking, and not optimal strategies. We also want to try to find Pareto efficient strategies that satisfy some wide range of possible outcomes, not necessarily try to aggregate everything to a single utility function, because that's very hard. And we also try to leverage low regret, so things you can do today that you probably will not regret, like wearing masks, or things that are very unlikely to impose a high cost, and adaptive strategies to achieve robustness. So these are a set of principles. In these different methods, they will implement them in different ways. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how one of these methods, called robust decision-making, works. So robust decision-making, RDM, it draws from 4 different frameworks to address uncertainty. So RDM draws from decision analysis. It is a decision analytical approach. If you have done decision analysis before, this will sound very familiar. It also draws from the idea of scenarios or multiple plausible futures. But scenarios are often not, or the traditional scenarios analysis, they often don't provide a lot of justification for how to quantitatively select the scenarios you're looking at. And the choice of scenarios can seem arbitrary. So RDM tries to avoid that. And there are some tools to help us do that a little bit better. It also draws from assumption-based planning, which is kind of an older method that was qualitative, and the idea of exploratory modeling. And Rob Lampert, in his 2019 RDM chapter, he discusses a little bit why RDM uses these methods. In RDM, the idea when you do a full RDM analysis is that you would do this iterative process. So the process starts with decision framing, where you define policy levers, uncertainty, outcomes of interest in relationships involving a problem. Then the idea is you build a model and then you evaluate a set of strategies across a set of features. This is the stress test step. After that, you do a vulnerability analysis where you might review new options or might review new features you need to consider, and that can generate decision relevant scenarios. And then you do this process a few times at least. The decision framing process is done with decision makers and stakeholders. And at some point, you do a trade-off analysis to show what is the final set of robust strategies or better strategies that were found during the process. So that's the idea. I will briefly walk over these steps. So the decision framing step, this first step, it uses this framework called XLRM. X stands for the uncertainties that are relevant to a decision problem. And so we talk to people, we do a workshop with people where we ask about the uncertainties that are relevant, what they're worried about. And we try to make a distinction between what they cannot control or what decision makers cannot control and the policy levers, what they can actually control. And then we also talked about the outcome metrics that should be used. What are the important goals that these policies need to achieve? And then the relationships, how we will model this thing, and what are the important relationships. After this, we go do the run, the stress test step. And in one sentence, it's really sampling from the uncertainty space, create a list of strategies based on the policy levers, and evaluate each strategy in each feature. A lot easier said than done, because there's a lot of work to be done here, especially when we want to inform models with data. So everything you need to do to run your model is kind of done in this step, meaning gathering information, calibrating the model, and so on and so forth. But eventually, what we really want to achieve is that we want to create this database of model runs that were used to stress test policies to look at how robust these strategies are. And that's what we do in the vulnerability analysis step. So there is a set of tools, methods that are used here to find regions in the parameter space. First, characterize the robustness of strategies. How do we measure robustness? There are a set of robustness metrics we can use. And then sometimes what we want to do is to find what are the regions in the parameter space that explain conditions under which the strategy fails. And that is often informative to policymakers. And so these are the scenarios that come out of the analysis. Not every RDM study does all these steps, but this is something that is often done. And then at some point, we do this trade-off analysis because we need to finish the process. Someone has to make a decision. And we often look at trade-offs arising from balancing multiple goals. So I want to be happy, be free, and I don't want to have any COVID strategy or any COVID case. That's not going to happen, right? There's some trade-off, a fundamental trade-off, and we need to look at this trade-off and communicate this trade-off. And sometimes there are trade-offs arising from different states of the world. So sometimes it can be something that is very good for one particular future, but very bad if something else happens. And there are ways to communicate these trade-offs as well. At the end of the day, we want to offer a menu of non-dominated options, strategies that are reasonably robust and better than the ones we were starting with. So back to the RDM process, that's how it works. Ideally, the outcome of this is that you exit the process with better strategies. You clarify what are their weaknesses, what are their strengths, what are the conditions under which we think they will succeed, what are the conditions under which we think they will fail, and have a plan if we face that future. And that's very helpful in many cases, because then policymakers can start make a decision and have a plan to deal with the future as it unfolds. So that's used in many fields, like water resources management is a very clear example. People have these plans to build, these large infrastructure projects, but we don't know exactly how much it's going to rain in, 10 years from now. And these processes can help them make decisions that are robust to the range of futures we might expect. Okay, so I hope I gave you a quick example of this RDM process. And I should also say, so all of this exists in the absence of, separate from infectious disease modeling. These things have been proposed years ago, and there is a community that improved those methods. So now I want to turn to the question of how do we use this to inform pandemic response, and how do we use this with infectious disease models? Can we get some utility out of these methods? So as an example, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Reopening California paper, which I already presented to this community, but just to remind you, back in 2021, we had a big problem to deal, which was how to answer this question of how to manage non-pharmaceutical interventions as we were starting to have vaccines and states, were shut down. So the question was, how do we reopen as we get vaccines? So most states, if you remember, they had a reopening plan. California had a plan called the Blueprint for a Safer Economy, and we had all these different risk levels. And depending on how many cases you have per person and other criteria, you would live under a set of constraints, right? So these plans, they were all kind of data-driven and so on, but there are many questions that need to be answered when you think about them. One is how stringent the plan should be. So I can have a plan that is very stringent or a plan that is not very stringent. And the other question is what restrictions should apply to each level, right? So what exactly widespread risk level means? Does that mean we are shutting everything down? Does that mean that we're not going to school? What exactly does that mean? And finally, how the stringency level and these restrictions should be managed over time, given other conditions, what's happening, like vaccination. So the questions we are thinking about is this plan really a robust strategy? And is this strategy Pareto efficient? Does that make society unnecessarily worse off or not? So I would like to think you to look at these different plans and choose one, just for the sake of the exercise, okay? So if you think about these different risk levels and COVID cases, green is everything is fine. Yellow is, okay, we have some cases, maybe hospitals are starting to get full. Orange is things are getting pretty bad. Red is things are pretty bad. So do something very strong to contain cases, right? And so you can have this strategy. This strategy is data-driven, and I would call this a highly cautious strategy, relative to a second strategy that is also data-driven, but really allows cases to rise a lot more before you do anything to stop this exponential increase. So my question to you is, which one would you pick with the little information I gave you? You probably go with two, right? Just based on what I know about this audience. Well, no, you probably go with one, sorry, which is a more cautious strategy, because by the time you get here, then hospitals are already full. There's not a lot you can do. But there are also many, well, if you just do a compromise between strategy 1 and 2, you can have many different levels of stringency, right? There's an infinite set of strategies that you can pursue, even if you just make compromises between 1 and 2. But there are also other types of strategies you can think about, like a time-varying strategy, where you start with a stringent strategy and vaccination starts here, and then at some point you relax because these cases are less likely to cause a catastrophic effect on the population. And we want to get, there's a lot of pressure to get kids back to school. So eventually we have to do that. You can also think about other time varying strategies where these bands kind of expand continuously, not in discrete steps. So there are many different reopening strategies one can think about. How do we choose among them? So what we did back in 2021 was to extend our original model to account for this phased vaccination and adaptive policy responses. We also estimated the distribution of some parameters that can be informed by past data with this Bayesian approximate computation approach. And then we account for uncertainty from future events, things that were not in the data. And then we use that to stress test 78 different reopening strategies that look like a highly cautious strategy, a less cautious strategy, and 2 types of time varying strategies. So what we found is that there are many, actually, there are losing strategies. There are strategies that make you worse off for no good reason. And what we found that the constant caution strategies, all strategies that were either solely stringent or solely relaxed, they're all dominated. They're all losing strategies. They result in more interventions and more COVID-19 deaths. So that was a finding from this paper. The other thing we also observed is that some deep uncertainties, like the change in transmissibility driven by new variant strains like Omicron that happened later after this paper, they are very important. And what they do is that they really shift this trade-off curve. So you can see that in the baseline, under the baseline assumptions, accounting for the uncertainty that we have from calibration, you get this trade-off surface. And then what happens when you have a new variant strain that is about 50% more transmissible, the whole trade-off surface is pushed and kind of expands as well. So a strategy that is very stringent like this, right? Very, few COVID-19 deaths and more days of interventions, they control deaths, yeah. But the days of intervention skyrocket. And the same goes for deaths. So this strategy increases here to larger proportions than days of interventions. But across all these scenarios, the losing strategies are the same. And so in that paper, we make that point that these constant strategies are dominated, and so they need to be adaptive, which was good because that's what California was doing as we were writing the paper. And it was interesting because we're not involved in that decision, but kind of they reached that conclusion as well. So these findings, they inform the design of response plans to a next pandemic without trying to make predictions that, as you can see, just based on information we had, would be very off, right? Okay, so going forward, what can we do to address this? So I already showed you a few concepts. I already showed you a few examples. And so my question is, how can we do, what can we do to address deep uncertainty and what you can do? So we are trying to do more of this. So we have this, we are one of the 30 phase 1 PIPP grants. And of course, there are many of you in this audience that are already on the same boat. And the idea that we want to do that is to use the center grant as well to look at how to develop and deploy methods for decision making under deep uncertainty. So hopefully we can continue that. With this planning grant, we are already offering these RDM participatory workshops to decision makers. And what we want to do there is to walk them through this process and then think about how we can improve decision making going forward using these methods. So this is one of the things we are doing. There's also other projects that are taking the goal of addressing deep uncertainty and making that a primary goal. So one of them probably will look at usually ignore epicon interactions. For example, the nurse labor market was really hit hard by the pandemic. I'm not sure if you look at travel nurses. And this is probably not sustainable, right? We have a boom and bust public health response system. So a future proposal will address relevant interactions between pandemics and labor markets, which is kind of a part of the system that is relevant. There are outcomes that are relevant, like inflation, and we don't address that currently with the models. Okay, and what can you do to address deep uncertainty, and what can you do about these things? Well, first, continue doing your great work. All you do really positions the field to move forward and maybe adopt these methods. You can also help me build some bridges between the DMDU methods field and your field. So consider using DMDU methods where appropriate, reading DMDU papers from other fields as well. And I should say we have an annual conference organized by the DMDU Society. And so consider submitting your uncertainty analysis paper. I'm planning on organizing a health modeling session. So if there's enough interest. So if you are interested in this thing, you know that you're doing work that is kind of related to that, you can present on that conference as well. We can have nice discussions. And you should also join the DMDU Society to stay in the loop. It's free, and you can join that. Okay, so now we'll open it for questions, and I hope I made you interested. I also have a final slide that should fulfill the funny part of this conversation, but I'll leave that for after the questions.
Thanks, Pedro. That was really great. I want to encourage folks to either put questions in the chat, put them in the Q&A, or raise your hand, and I will try to acknowledge you. I have a question here from Kat Shea that I'll just read out, and you can reply. The scenario hub, et cetera, were designed to rapidly sample outputs from multiple independent scientific method models for decision-making in the face of uncertainty. How would your methods work in time-sensitive settings, which I think we can argue that the pandemics are time-sensitive? So,
yes, Thank you, Katrina, for this question. I think this is a great question. I think infectious disease modelers, they really have problems that are as uncertain as the problems that we have in these other fields like climate change and natural resources, but you have the same level of uncertainty in a very short time frame. So it's a lot harder, right? So there are not many policy problems where so many people can die so fast, and you need to do something to inform those decisions also very fast. So that makes this really hard. So I thought about quite a bit about it, and I think there are a few things one can do. One is, based on all the modeling that we did during the pandemic, one can do some preemptive stress testing, right? So can we find policy interventions, or can we reach an agreement over what to do in a new pathogen, and maybe you can think about different scenarios, different types of pathogens. Can we think about policy portfolios that would respond well and have a consensus about the robustness of these strategies? I think we should be talking a lot more about doing that. And so this work, part of this, I think, should be done preemptively, such that when you have an emergency, you already know what to do. You already at least have a playbook, and you have stress test those strategies so you can show, look, we thought about this during the peacetime, so we can act better during the real time. And then to do that kind of work in real time, that's one of the goals of that center grant. So the idea is you would already have like some policy interventions established. There's a consensus around them, and then you need some computational power and infrastructure to do those analyses in a quick turnaround. I would say we are not there yet, but we won't be, unless we work on this before we actually need those tools. Yeah, maybe there's more we could do, but that's kind of my 2-minute answer. And yeah, I'm happy to discuss more about that. I'm very interested in making sure that these things can be helpful.
Great, thanks, Pedro. I'm not seeing other questions here, but in that gap, I'll throw a couple of mine out because I've probably got enough that we could discuss for the next hour if we had the time, which we don't. But one of the things that occurs to me here is this discussion of uncertainty that I would like to ask about is what the one you didn't mention that I'll sort of call, for those of us who are old enough to remember, I'll call Rumsfeld uncertainty, in the sense of not knowing what you don't know.
Yeah.
And how do you, are there principled ways to check your assumptions in terms of making sure that you are not missing important areas of uncertainty or important values in the decision making? Because a lot of this feels like it could be a closed world kind of problem where if you don't get the right people in the room, that you'll miss out on some important things. So are there principled ways to avoid that trap?
Yeah. So that's a great question. In reality, these methods are really being used to address known unknowns, meaning things that are unknown today, but we know enough about their possibility that is very responsible to consider them in the analysis. That's my fun part that I should not have shown. But I will say that that's one of the reasons why in this process, there is this very important decision framing step, because the universe of possible uncertainties, possible futures is infinite. And so is the universe of possible alternatives, possible decisions. So you need a process to constrain that. Of course, you don't want to do that prematurely. And you want to involve people with different worldviews and you need to have enough representation in the decision framing step such that you don't, shut down potential futures that you should be looking at. But they need to be prioritized. That's true. And we cannot possibly look at every possible future, but we can do probably more than just focusing on the status quo. And that's, I think, the direction that these methods try to pursue. So, yeah. So do what you can. And that's often better than what policymakers have been doing.
Okay, great. We got a couple other questions here. I'm just going to read to you from the Q&A. From Jason Gantenberg, it seems that the DMDU framework implicitly hedges against extreme scenarios, but if not, can you say more about how we might do so?
Yeah. So these DMDU frameworks, they explicitly they help you hedge against extreme scenarios, and depending on the robustness metric you use, you will be more conservative or less conservative. So I didn't talk too much about the robustness metrics, but that's what they do. So instead of just using the expected value, let's say, of the policy over the future, we don't like to do that, because one, that relies critically on the probability distribution of all model inputs. So what do you do instead? You use some robustness metric, and that can include a regret measure, an opportunity loss measure, and some percentile. So if you want to look at the worst possible case, you can. Often we don't do that. We choose a regret measure that looks at, let's say, the 75th percentile. So you're not looking at the worst possible outcome, but some of the worst. And then you try to find strategies that are not really bad under that bad scenario. I hope that clarified.
Okay, now there's another comment here which doesn't have a question to it, but I think there is an implicit challenge here. Of course, there were pandemic playbooks developed after H1N1, but they were discarded when COVID arose. So do you want to react to that?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. I mean, even before the pandemic, there was this set of metrics about pandemic preparedness and what are the countries that were most prepared based on our prior metrics, and US was very well prepared. Apparently, that proved to not be true. So I think there is some value in anticipation, in the sense that can prompt organizations to improve to decide on improving infrastructure that needs to be ready in the beginning of the pandemic. For example, I think we all agree that we should have a lot larger stockpile of good masks in the beginning of the pandemic, because we rationed that supply. We told people, oh, this is for medical people, and that could be really useful if we could get those masks, a large supply of masks, and consensus that people should wear them during those first months. Probably we wouldn't be as hard, and I don't think we would run out of oxygen, let's say, in some cities in Brazil, like we did. So I think anticipation helps. It's probably not enough to completely solve the problem. And I'm personally not very optimistic that we will do very well in a next pandemic like this one, but I think it helps, and that's I think what we can do.
Okay, another question here: what do you think about democratizing and scaling access to these decision-making analyses across scales, from local public health departments to state, national, and international levels?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that's a key difficulty in public health, especially public health as it relates to infectious diseases, because a good public health response depends on good responses everywhere. So it's not enough to convince one person in the White House that they need to have robust plans. Every public health department that issues public health orders, they have a substantial effect on how this goes. And I think we all agree that some public health departments would not be resourced to do any of this. So I think these methods, I think they can be used to test policies, arrive at some conclusions that are general enough, such that public health departments everywhere can adopt them and can have some consensus and some coordination. I don't necessarily see that every public health in the world should do this stress test of their policies. I don't see that as necessary. I think it's more a question of arriving at consensus as a community and then communicating it to public health departments. And of course, some public health departments that are well-resourced should lead the charge, right? They should lead this and demand these kinds of things. But no, not everyone will do that. I don't see that happening. We can facilitate that to a certain extent, but I just don't see that happening.
Okay. Now, here's another question that's a little bit long. I'm going to read it and hopefully we can get some response. Something that seems to be absent from the analysis as presented, I don't know whether it's present in the paper or not, is the additional element of public perception, public response that differentiates public messaging and even more so public mandates from either individual action or governmental decisions that are purely about what positive acts the government itself will perform. So you gave an example of masking as a low regret action. If someone masks in a situation where masking is not actually necessary, this costs them little. But if the government encourages, let alone mandates, masking in a situation where it's later shown to not actually be necessary, it undermines credibility and maybe punishes people who are not actually harming others.
I mean, when I mean mask, I'm thinking, especially based on what we know today, we're talking about mask indoors, crowded spaces. We know you get benefit from that. But you're right in pointing out that the issue of communication is really hard, is another dimension of uncertainty that we consider to some extent in the model. For example, in the model, we consider the possibility that after getting vaccines, people would go out and mix more, right? Like that was the whole point for many people. So we considered that aspect. But no, we didn't consider fully kind of the behavioral response to, the public health mandates as almost as a kind of game theoretic issue going on. And I think that's going on, but we did not model that.
Right. And I think that to me gets right back to that question of the unknowns, right?
Yeah.
That you didn't know to do that. Presumably the next time around you would. But is there some way to look at this to say, well, what other things might possibly happen that we haven't considered? And it's sort of like the search for unintended consequences of a system. You're asking for evidence of things you haven't seen, which becomes very difficult.
Yeah, exactly. It is difficult. It is doable to a certain extent, but it requires some imagination, right? And sometimes it's helpful, right? Because sometimes there will always be someone in the room or in a problem that will say, that thing that happened in the future, and at that time it didn't seem plausible. It's just that these people are often not heard, or they're not taken seriously during the decision framing. We try to do that as best as we can, and that's kind of the whole purpose of having a decision framing process to start the problem.
Excellent.
Process, yeah.
Okay, so I have about 2 minutes at the top of the hour, Pedro. Maybe you should show us your last slide. And
oh, sure, yeah. Thank you for reminding me that. So I asked my colleague. I mean, it's an anonymous DMDU memes person. I don't know who runs this Twitter account, but there's a DMDU memes account. And I just want to say that this field can be funny. These people have some sense of humor.
If you want to be adaptive to literally everything, you don't have a plan anymore. I like it. Well, look, great. Pedro, this is really interesting. I really appreciate it. I know I'm going to be in touch with a couple questions I've got, and I encourage people to reach out to Pedro. Also, we have requests for your slides, so we'll follow up to try to get the slides and find out how to distribute them. The talk will be up soon on the MIDAS YouTube channel, so you can watch that. And Pedro, thanks again for an interesting talk, and thanks everybody for their questions, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Great. Take care, all.
Take care.